Hello, and welcome to our second interview with Michael Ventura. In our last interview, we went over his childhood, and we stopped around 8th grade when he decided he wanted to be a writer. So we're going to continue on from that point today. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I guess we stopped after I won that writing contest at Brooklyn's Junior High School 123.
Yes.
In Miss Fine's English class. And it was the first thing that my peers admired about me, recognized about me. And I went, wow, this thing could be mine to do. And it didn't even come that clearly. But it was just suddenly writing was something. It wasn't a dream. It was something I'd done. And won a contest. And wow. And then my life changed very drastically. Some would say catastrophically, but it worked out well for me. And I'm just going to give kind of the headlines so you know how drastic it was. October 58, this was before the writing contest, my mother had a major breakdown, and we went to live, me and my two little twin brothers and my littler sister. So I went to live with my father, Michael Luciano Ventura, and his second wife, Margie, and my new brother, Davey, that they had. And they were living in a tenement on Myrtle Avenue under the Myrtle Avenue L. And this tenement had 2 bedrooms, and we were 7 people. I can leave that to your imagination. In the spring, right after I won that contest, and was feeling my way in a new way, kind of walking in a new way. The short version is my stepmother tried to commit suicide. A week later, my mother tried to commit suicide. Right around that time, my father decided to put my twin siblings and my sister's sibling in a Catholic orphanage, and I packed a suitcase and left. I was 13 years old. I just left. What happened to me then would take too long to tell, but I ended up the ward of a Unitarian minister's family. They called me the ward of a Unitarian minister's family in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. And being in New England was like being on Mars. These people didn't eat the same food. They didn't eat. They weren't of anywhere near the same class. I mean, this was he was a Unitarian minister, the head of the family, Skipper Laws, and they were in the parsonage of a famous Unitarian church that had once been Theodore Parker's church, a famous abolitionist. And Unitarians were still a force in New England then. You know, like I'm exaggerating now, but some major percentage, like half or 25% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Unitarians. And the Transcendentalists, Emerson, all those people were Unitarians. And so it was still a force, as I say, in New England. And Skipper had Theodore Parker's church, as I said. And so we were living in what they call the parsonage. That's the house that the church owns that the minister and his family live in. And this was like a 3.5-story house with a lot of rooms and staircases and attics and cellars. I mean, it was like something out of a novel to me, or a scary movie. Literally, they ate different food. They ate English food, which wasn't very interesting. It was a different diet. A lot of, I don't know, meatloafs. Lots of meatloafs. Every Tuesday night meatloaf, that kind of thing. But here I was suddenly, warm, secure, fed. We weren't going to get evicted. Nobody's going to turn off the lights. It was a neighborhood where I was a tough guy. Not that anybody messed with me, or I didn't mess with anybody, but I came from Brooklyn streets. These people seemed very innocent to me. And I was writing. I turned 14 that October. And I had a notebook, the school notebook with a black and white squirrely hardcover, cardboard cover. And I started writing about things, just things that I saw, things basically about a paragraph, like a full page, maybe over onto the other side of the page, about things I saw, about a girl I had a crush on across the street, about all of this. And I was looking at this class of people who I had never known. Everybody I know in my childhood, except for Jimmy Bartmus, who was a Protestant, was Italian, Sicilian, or Jewish, or Irish. And everybody was Catholic or Irish. Or Jewish. And so this was a complete environment. I'd never known Protestants as a class, as a culture. And the other thing I could see, and I could see it right off, because if you're a child alone, with nobody really, like no family to protect you. I didn't have my father's phone number even. My mother was in a mental hospital. There was nobody I could call. I was on my own. And I took to it pretty well, because thank God I was away from the adults who were making all the bad decisions of my life. But at the same time, I could see these people, this family, which I don't want to say a bad word about, except that they were miserable. I mean, we were in a lot of trouble. We were terrified. We were all kinds of things. But we weren't depressed. We didn't have time to be depressed. We were very alive, as frightened and scared. We were animals in the jungle, but vivid. These people were sad. They were miserable. I didn't know why, because they had the food. They had the money. They didn't have to worry about anything my family had to worry about. Nobody was blacklisting them. They weren't getting in trouble with the cops. They weren't having big scenes where the cops came and a stepmother would tear the phone out of the wall and throw it at my father, and none of that was going on. Nobody broke a broom over my head like she did.
This was a suburb of Boston?
Yeah. West Roxbury is just sort of adjacent to Boston the way Santa Monica is adjacent to Los Angeles,
Yeah.
It's not really a suburb. Boston just kind of blends into West Roxbury and several other places, Cambridge and like that.
So it's pretty urban.
And it was urban, but it was suburban, but not the way you think of it in the West, where they're intentionally building suburbs. Once upon a time, West Roxbury was its own town. The houses were each different. Where the neighborhood, Wren Street, where we lived, these were big houses. These were houses with like 8 rooms, maybe more. They had big porches. The house across the street where Jan McCann lived, who became my very chaste lady love, had a running porch, covered porch all around. And this was a whole different way of being human. But they were sad. I would learn why over the years, but there was a sadness hanging over it, and the things we yelled about is what they kept secret. The things we kept secret are the things that they yelled about when they yelled. Almost nobody ever yelled. They came from a yelling culture, a yelling, cursing culture, and they didn't curse either. And so I was in Robert Gould Shaw Junior High School in West Roxbury. I was writing. I had my notebooks. I was reading everything. Judy was, who was in her senior or junior year of high school and seemed a great deal older than me. She and I read aloud Stephen Vincent Benet's John Brown's Body. It's when I discovered poetry. A lot of the first poetry I loved was rhymes. It was basically English 19th century. And so I was discovering all that. I discovered Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg at the same time. And I don't know quite how that happened, but they snuck into that house. And in that house, the son, Carl, was actually about a half a year older than me, but he had in New England, they started school a year later than we did in New York. In New York, they started school very early, earlier than most of the country. So I was a grade ahead of him. But he and I became real good friends because he didn't like his family either. And they saved my life. Sometimes you don't like the people who save your life. Sometimes you resent them because your own parents couldn't save your life. And you're embarrassed. I lied a lot back then. I lied about everything because I didn't want to admit what I really came from. As you once said, Brendan, I've been running for that all my life. I've stopped running now, but I was running, yes. and so now it's getting on to be spring. Winter in New England, that was a trip. And I have this English teacher who is insufferable. He liked himself a lot. He wanted everybody to like him a lot. He thought he was hot stuff. And he gives an essay assignment right about spring. And I'm listening very closely. He just said right about spring. He didn't say what spring. And so I wrote about every spring I could think of. The spring in my ballpoint pen. The spring on a door, that helps you close the screen door. The springs of a car. I wrote about every spring I could think of for about 200 words, and he thought I was very clever about that. I said, "No, Mr. So-and-so, I can't remember his name. You didn't say the season. I listened hard. You didn't say the season." So I got points for being clever and a wise ass and like that. But I was polite, and I was different from the other kids because I came from different stuff, but at the same time they tolerated me. And then I saw the film On the Beach. Now, On the Beach does not have much credit as a film. I've never heard a film critic talk about it. If film critics talk about films about atomic bombs, they talk about Dr. Strangelove. Now, Dr. Strangelove was made in '64, which was after the Cuban Missile Crisis and after the test ban treaty, where it was agreed by the major nuclear powers, who at the time were the USSR, the U.S.A., the U.K., and France, that there'd be no more testing above ground, no more testing in the sea, and no more testing and no testing in outer space, even though we weren't in outer space yet, really. And so it wasn't as visible as it had been in the 50s, the bombs. Now, a man named Neville Shute had wrote this novel On the Beach in the late 50s, and it had become a big bestseller because it really made clear that in nuclear war, everybody dies eventually. Now, they didn't have enough missiles to create a nuclear winter. They had enough missiles for the United States and the USSR and Europe to bomb every major city, which would have done it because that's enough missiles to irradiate the air, and gradually the air makes its way on the upper crust winds down to the upper atmosphere winds down to Australia, and kills everybody. They didn't make a big thing about killing the animals, but kill the animals too. And mammals couldn't handle it. Insects could, maybe fish could, we don't know, but mammals couldn't handle it. And everybody dies. And this was made into a movie with big stars: Gregory Peck, Ava Gardner, Fred Astaire, Tony Perkins. It's some big stars. And in the movie, everybody dies. There hadn't been a movie like that. Everybody dies. You see Tony Perkins and his wife, played by somebody maybe named Donna Anderson, give the suicide pills, because dying of radiation sickness is horrible, give the suicide pills to the baby in the crib and then take them themselves. They killed the baby in the crib. I'm sitting there going, holy shit. And so this guy, this English teacher, asks about the flag. And I'm thinking, I just want to kill this guy. And you know, I had a bunch of paragraphs about some interesting things. I thought, they must be right about the flag. So I wrote about, and this was really what I consider to be the first piece of writing I ever did. I wrote a paragraph, couldn't have been more than 500 words, maybe less, about a flag on a flagpole, tattered. There's nothing, everything is dead. It's the last flag hanging there, an American flag. There's been a war, there is nothing. Everybody dies. And my conclusion was, if the USSR launches missiles against the United States, it would be immoral for the United States to launch back. We should just take the hit, let the country go, so that would save humanity. Maybe if they just bombed our cities and we didn't bomb them back, humanity would have a chance. It would be immoral for us to launch when we know we're all going to die anyway because they launched. And it would be immoral for us to launch first. And this teacher didn't know whether to shit or throw rocks. He read it. He didn't grade it. He didn't talk about it. He didn't look me in the eye. It disappeared. But I consider that my first real piece of writing. I was 14 years old. And it was the spring of 1960. Back then, elections didn't really start until September. The election year. It wasn't a year-round big thing. The fall of 1960, John F. Kennedy ran again against Richard Nixon. And I was writing. By then I was writing. So I was very, very lucky. The next year, the Laws family moved to Waterville, Maine. Right smack in the center of Maine. Talk about completely, utterly Mars as far as I was concerned. And a little school called Coburn Classical Institute that was actually an old school from the 1840s. It was, I believe, the first school in the United States to try co-ed education. Back in the 1840s when co-ed education was really radical. And because co-ed education assumed that the girls were equal to the boys. As I say, Unitarians have a civilizing influence, if you want to call it that, in New England. And it was a wonderful old church. The elm trees hadn't all died yet in Waterville. There was an elm plague in the 60s, and by the end of the 60s, this city of wonderful, wonderful elm trees everywhere, they were gone. And it was a sweet school, Coburn Classical Institute. My classes didn't have more than 15, 18 kids in them, in the whole class. It was different kind of teaching. It was semi-private, what they call the New England Country Day School. You took a test to get in, and I failed the test, but I got it anyway, again, because my reading scores were so high. And I read all these books. And I go, oh, well, let them in. Now, the thing that happened in the fall of 1960 that really influenced me, besides going to the school, was a show named Route 66 came on the television. And it wasn't like any other show. You had these two guys just riding around the country, and it was written by this guy, Sterling Silliphant, who was influenced by Tennessee Williams. And people really talked about stuff on that show. The writing was terrific. There was a kind of philosophic bent, kind of what I called later off-road jukebox existentialism. And I realized what I wanted to do. I wanted to write, and I wanted to go around the country and meet all the crazy women that were on Route 66. and get odd jobs, and this was my plan. And when they were trying to get geometry into me, and I got D's. I've got my high school report cards. It's a joke. And I got D's in anything I didn't like, anything I wasn't interested in. And they'd say, you need this to get into college. And I said, I don't need to get to college. I just need to learn how to drive. and that's my plan. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to write. And this was, you're impractical, you're this, you're that. No, that's my plan. That's what I want to do. Because I realized, and I realized this not in retrospective, I realized it then. They were raising us, the culture was raising us to be like the grown-ups and do what the grown-ups did, which was serve that version of halfway benevolent, halfway oppressive capitalism that quote-unquote made this country great. And I didn't want any part of it. I didn't want to be the grown-ups that I saw. The grown-ups that I saw in real life. I didn't see anybody in the middle class I wanted to be like. I didn't see anybody in the working class I wanted to be like. So I didn't know what I was about, except I was a writer. I was going to write, and I was writing and writing and writing. Sometimes I got good grades on my papers. Sometimes they went too far out, weird. I got a D because I didn't really write the paper that was assigned. But we also got great reading assignments at Coburn, especially all 3 years I was there. We read Melville. We read Nathaniel Hawthorne. We read Shakespeare. We read in junior year by this wonderful teacher who'd been blinded in the Korean War, Mr. Carlo. We read. He gave me Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce and Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad, and I had to study those independently, and he gave each people independent assignments. It was a small class. He could do that. And he really taught. Without Mr. Carlo, I don't know where I'd be, because he taught the Strunk and White elements of style, and he taught us how to build a paragraph. Elements of Style became our Bible. The Strunk and White version. Now, sometimes you order just the Strunk version. You want the Strunk and White version if you're going to order this. It became our Bible, and it is a basic book, very, very well written, that really shows you what to do and what not to do, and it's right. Yeah. and Mr. Carlo thought that you build a paragraph the way you build a chair or a table, and how to get into it and how to get out of it, and when to paragraph and when to comma. And these things sound basic, but they're important, and they're not always taught. And right now, they're not taught hardly anywhere in that kind of way. And I say that because I was a high school teacher for several years, and in a Waldorf high school in Los Angeles, and I was teaching that stuff. The other English teachers weren't. So that was very exciting to me. School was exciting. I liked the dances. I liked being a teenager. It was the only time I was ever a kid my age, in my age group. And I liked that, it sounds like a terrible thing to say, but I didn't miss anybody. My sister asked me years later, did you miss us? I said, no, I didn't miss anything. I didn't miss anybody.
Was there any communication with your original family at that time?
My mother was in a mental hospital for most of it, and I wrote her letters. My father never called me. My Aunt Mary called me on my birthdays. My mother and I wrote letters. I would go down on Christmas time and spring break to visit in New York. But when I came into a family gathering of my aunts, uncles, I was no longer treated like one of the children. I had left. And I walked in and sat at the grown-ups table, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee just like them. And nobody said me nay. My mother would be, if she was out of the hospital, they'd put her up in a kind of a city-supported hotel. It was called the Ben Franklin. It was on 77th and Broadway. It hasn't been there in years. And it was people who could who were mentally handicapped, but in terms of mental health, but who were well enough to work. And so they would have nominal rents in these tiny rooms in the Ben Franklin, and they'd work. And then they'd have a nervous breakdown and go to the hospital and come out and work again. And my mother was like that for a few years. And she would get me a tiny room, and I mean it was a tiny room. It was a closet. And they didn't have TVs in the rooms. They had radios. In those days, you almost never had a television in a hotel room that had radios. And I'd listen to Gene Shepherd, and I'd walk all around Manhattan. So I would visit, but it was totally me on my own as an adult, even though I was 14, 15, 16. And there was nobody who had the authority in New York to boss me around. And my father and Margie, my stepmother, visited my brothers and sister in the home maybe 5 times the entire time they were there. They were there 6 years, I think. And on 2 of those times I went with them. When my mother was out of the hospital, she took the train to Peekskill, where the children's home was, St. Joseph's, every visiting day, every weekend. She'd save all her money and go up there, and they'd walk around and buy some ice cream, and she'd take the train home. And as I say, she and I wrote letters. When I started to write poems, I'd send them to her, and she'd critique them. I mean, she was pretty smart, my mother, and we had that. So we kept our relationship. My relationship with my father didn't start to exist again until the 1970s. But as a writer, because this is what we're talking about, I really knew I wanted to be a writer. I really knew that I was a writer in my heart. Talking about Mr. Carlo, the first paper I wrote for him, I got a D. This was the beginning of the 10th grade, 11th grade. And I was furious. How could I get a D? Because in public school, I get A's. And he showed me how I got a D. I didn't use this sentence, how did this paragraph connect with this, blah, 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 blah. And I understood what he was talking about as he said it. Oh, my God, he's right. By the mid-year, I was getting B's from Mr. Carlo. And by the end, I was getting A's. And an A from Mr. Carlo was like a Bronze Star in a war. It was major. It was really something. And at the end of the year, he awarded me 2 books I still have. James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake and James Joyce's Dubliners as a reward for how hard I worked in my junior year. And that's really when I learned how to write prose. That really laid the foundation for everything else. If I hadn't had Mr. Carlo in Waterville, Maine, at the Coleman Classical Institute, I don't think my life would have been the same at all. The next year, because he always pissed off the administration, he was gone, and we had a teacher who was just as good but different, an English teacher, John Judson. This was the senior year. John Judson taught us how to read. I mean, how to read what was really there in the book. We didn't have textbooks or anything. He gave us novels. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Wind, Sand, and Stars, memoir of his flying days. John Hersey's A Single Bell, which was a book set in China. Graham Greene's A Burnt Out Case, which was set in Africa. So through him we were seeing the world through prose. He gave me Nelson Algren, who I hadn't even heard of, but who had written the novels The Man with the Golden Arm, Walk on the Wild Side. He coined that phrase. Who Reed stole it from him. And the book of short stories, The Neon Wilderness, he coined that phrase too. And there I was reading about the streets. The Chicago streets were very like what I came from. Poles who were very like the Italians I came from. And I'd never read anything like that before. I recognize this. And he gave me Nelson Algren as my assignment. If I hadn't had these 2 teachers, They gave me a foundation to know good from bad on the page, on my own page, which is most important. And we had a history teacher, and this is a senior year, Mrs. Willard. And she made us research. She taught us how to research. To show you the standard of this New England, old-timey New England school. Loose. I mean, you know, we had dances twice a month. Each class would put on dances. There was sports, but low key. I was even on a basketball team, for instance. You can imagine how bad we were. But the standards were high. At the end of our senior year in English, Mr. Judson he assigned, give me what you think of each of our major readings this year and how they contributed, this is his words, to your philosophy of life. And we're all sitting there, about 15 of us going, we're supposed to have a philosophy of life, are you kidding? But he was drawing this out of us. What do you think of your place in the world right now? What do you think of this? It was a 4,000 word or 5,000 word essay we were supposed to write. Like, that's 20 double-spaced type pages for 17-year-olds. And it was basically a college assignment. And our history teacher, Mrs. Willard, put even Mr. Judson to shame by assigning different research projects to every one of us. And my research project was Jefferson's Embargo Act. And you're forgiven if you haven't heard of it, because I hadn't heard of it. And prime sources only. I was going up to Colby College up on the hill, to the library there. I was going down to Augusta, capital of the state, to the library there for prime sources, access to prime sources. Taught me how to research. And that was a 5,000-word paper. And I did very well on both of them. And that was my education. Without that education, I don't think the rest of my life would have happened how it did. And I gained respect, like I had in the 8th grade, for what I love to do. And I had no doubt in my mind that my plan for life was correct. They wanted me to go to college. I applied to one college, Goddard College in Vermont, because my grades weren't going to get me anywhere really good. And because I was trying to be fair. On the one hand, the laws were miserable. They were sad. This was a family with dark secrets. I'm not even going to talk about that because they saved my life. So they're all dead now, almost all of them. Even Carl's dead. And we stayed friends, by the way, me and Carl. We lost touch sometimes, got back in touch. We stayed friends. And
what was New England like at that time in the early 60s, and what was Waterville like?
Good question. Waterville, and I looked this up not too long ago, a few months ago. Waterville reached the height of its population when we got there, 18,000 people. It was on the Kennebec River. Well, it's still on the Kennebec River. And its Main Street shops were all open. It was a thriving little New England town that didn't know it was about to die. And Colby College is still there. It's still considered a fairly good school. And there was a lumber mill. Down the hill, we were up on the top of the hill. The hill went steeply down because it was another parsonage, a big Unitarian parsonage. As the hill went steeply down was the French Canadians. That's where they lived. And they went to the public school. There was almost no French Canadians in Coburn. There was no black person in Coburn. There were no black people in Maine, except a man named Johnny Earther, who really influenced my life. So the French Canadians, Canucks, which is like calling me a wop, and calling a Puerto Rican a spick. The Canucks lived down there. I almost never saw them. This was a segregated middle class. You didn't need any money segregated at all. You didn't need any laws to segregate. This was a protected middle class, a home-owning class that I went to school with. The kids who were from out of town, Steve Johnson, Glennis Rossignol, and others, they lived on what I would think of as a farm. I mean, they had several acres, a big house, not rich. Nobody was rich. In Waterville of that time, you had a pretty affluent middle class, but not showy affluent. You had some rich people, probably nobody I ever knew. But you basically had a wide middle class and a fairly narrow working class. People who worked at the mill, people who worked on the river. I don't ever saw the river. For instance, it wasn't a culture where all the kids in high school had cars. Colin and I walked to school. Even if it was 5 degrees outside, we walked to school, about a mile. And it wasn't, as I said about New York at the time, there wasn't marijuana was a rumor, if that. There were no drugs that I was aware of in Waterville, Maine, except beer. And we were good kids. We were very average kids that way. We were, I smoked, a few smoked, but basically we didn't smoke, we didn't drink, we didn't do drugs. We liked our school, we liked each other. It was like stepping out of an Andy Hardy movie in some ways. It was New England that had not been fucked over by Walmart yet. Now there's a big Walmart outside of most New England towns. That didn't happen so long after I left. Now what did happen in 1962 that did influence me as a writer was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was a very, very strange thing, and kind of gets lost in the legend of that time. People don't talk about it much. When I was teaching at Highland Hall Waldorf School in San Fernando Valley, and I had a class in 1999, a poetry class. It was called Poetry Through History. And one of my assignments was I asked the kids, the students, to go home and talk to their parents and grandparents about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Get their memories about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because people don't talk about it. And there was one very good film about it in the late 60s, a television film. And then later on there was that film that 13 Days, which isn't that good in terms of, it brings out some new facts, but gets some old facts wrong, because it's too slick. But basically, people don't know about it. It wasn't handed down. And they came back going, God, I asked my grandfather, and he said, "Oh my God, what did you ask me that for? That was a terrible time," And they based their poems and everything on their reaction to what they learned from their parents and grandparents and uncles. But me, now I'd read about Castro, and I was for a 16, I was 16 when it was going on. I turned 17 like 2 weeks later. For that age, I was pretty hip in the sense of I knew who Fidel Castro was. I knew what he was fighting for. I agree with some of it. I didn't agree with other of it, but I knew that there was this stuff going on. And we're looking, and I'm going, we are going to, I'm the guy who wrote the thing about the flag and the scene on the beach. I'm going, we are going to fucking end civilization for fucking Cuba? Are you people out of your minds? And the big factor for me is everybody I loved was going to get bombed. My mother, my brothers, my sister, people who'd mattered to me along the way, they all lived in the radius. My aunts and uncles, my cousins, Italian cousins are tight. My cousin Tony, my cousin Rocco, they all lived in the radius of the direct hit. If not the hit itself, the blast and the radiation radius. If this thing started, everybody knew New York was going down. And I felt this very personally. What if it wasn't a target? We'd get the radiation, we'd probably die too. It'd take a little longer. But these motherfuckers were talking about killing everybody I loved. And I'm not talking about the motherfuckers on the other side. I'm talking about the motherfuckers on our side who were saying they'd go to war over Cuba. And I wasn't, I could step back and see it. I was susceptible to some of the romanticism, is what I'm saying, of enormous decisions were being made. An enormous amount of pressure was on everybody. It took a lot of guts for the Kennedys to stay in the White House. They didn't dive for their underground bunkers. They were right there. And the bunkers wouldn't have saved them. Their families were there. Either it was ruthlessness or guts or something of the two, but nobody was running for cover. You had to admire that. But at the same time, these lunatics were about to end the world.
Yeah.
And these lunatics were about to kill the people I love.
So this period of time, let's say 59 to 63 that we're talking about, I kind of consider it to be a kind of higher-minded time, and it's typified culturally, at least to me, as there was folk music before, obviously, but this was a kind of a time when folk music was being actually popularized.
Yes.
There was kind of, I don't want to say cheesy because I like the Kingston Trio, but there was more popular things like the Kingston Trio, and but there was also there was a lot of depth to that folk music era.
Definitely.
And there was a like I said, just a kind of higher mindedness. The civil rights movement is really taking off in a bunch of different directions. And people are becoming more politicized. So, from that perspective, can you give me some insight into that period of time, from the perspective of that, the kind of high-minded activism, folk music era?
Well, yes, it definitely can, because from in my sophomore and junior years, me and Carl and my best friend in my class, Mark Kirsten, and a guy who was a class ahead of us, Rick Keller, and his girlfriend Janet, and a marvelous singer named Alice, We had a folk song group.
I didn't know
based
that.
on the Weavers. We had a folk song group. We played at church things. We played at picnics. We played anywhere that they let us play. and I don't think we sang very well. Alice did. Alice sang like an angel. In fact, for the first time, Alice heard the first Joan Baez records we found. I forget. I think Rick Keller must have, because he was so hip to all of this. And Rick Keller was a kind of Pete Seegerish guy. He even looked like him. Tall, skinny, bony, and he could really play. He could play guitar. He could play banjo. And we sang the anti-war songs. We sang the peace songs. We sang the standard folk songs. We sang a bunch of Weaver stuff. We sang a bunch of Woody Guthrie and Lead Belly stuff. We played Big Bill Brunsey blues records and Lightnin' Hopkins. Maybe we haven't gotten the Lightnin' Hopkins yet, but Big Bill Brunsey for sure. And Sonny Terry and somebody McGee. We played their stuff. We played Bessie Smith records. And I was getting into jazz. We played Louis Armstrong a lot. And so we were a folk song group. And we played at youth conventions. We played at church things. We were part of that folk song culture. The early Dylan stuff. Kingston Trio. I like the Kingston Trio. I stand up for the early records of the Kingston Trio.
Me too.
And I'll stand up for them against anybody. I don't care. They did some nice stuff. And the guy who started the Kingston Trio and then left it when it got too commercial, Jon Stewart, is very, very respected among Nashville and other kind of songwriters. Jasmine and I saw June Carter Cash, is that her name?
Yeah.
Give a show in Sacramento about 3 years ago, and Jon Stewart had just died, and she talked about him. And nobody can mess with her pedigree. Carter family and Johnny Cash. And he lived all his life. He wrote the Monkees song, the original Daydream Believer. The lyrics are different from what the Monkees did it, but the way the Monkees did it, there's some changes. But that song supported him the rest of his life, so I'm happy for that. In any case, yes, there was. You're describing that right, I believe. There was Odetta was a very big singer for us. So there was that going on. Rock and roll had not gotten cerebral yet, and it had not gotten cynical. There was nothing cynical about rock and roll in those days.
Can you talk a little about that, like the I don't know if I'd say transition, but just for lack of a better word, the transition from rockabilly or rock and roll into like teenagers becoming more fans of folk music. Are they looking for something deeper? You know what I mean?
I think it was kind of a double track, and for me it was a triple track, because my first music that I loved was doo-wop music.
Yeah.
Which came out of barbershop quartets and gospel. And doo-wop music was poor people's music, because whether you were white or black, because it didn't need musicians.
Yeah.
You could have a rocking doo-wop band without any musicians. And young Italians singing doo-wop on the stoops and the tenements, that happened. Young Italians singing doo-wop as they walk through the school halls, being told to shut up by the teachers, that happened. So there was that. There was American Bandstand, which had a big cultural effect in the sense of popularizing rock and roll, but popularizing the dancing. So the going from rockabilly into kind of slicker rock and roll, and it got kind of vapid for a while, Fabian and Frankie Avalon, but then getting the hit of early Motown, where you had Smokey Robinson and Mary Wilson, and I'll never forget the first time I heard the Supremes' Baby Love. It was like this incredible breath of fresh air coming from God knows where. That baby love, my baby love. It sounded so, they were our age, for Christ's sake. And it sounded so fresh and alive and healthy and fun to dance to. And then
did that saccharine, like when you talk about Fabian, that kind of like Pat Boone, Fabian style of more slick corporate rock and roll, did that occur after the plane crash with Buddy Holly and Richie Valens and the Big Bopper? Like, was that already kind of a thing, a phenomena happening?
What year did that crash?
59.
Refresh my memory. 59. No, you had Frankie Avalon before 59.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure. You certainly had Pat Boone before 59. But the biggest thing was Elvis.
right.
And he combined everything. And my favorite Elvis movie is King Creole.
Yeah.
Because I think you get closer to the real Elvis in King Creole than you get in any other picture you ever made.
What year does he join the Army?
60, something like that, 59, 60.
Yeah, okay.
King Creole came out in 59. I think he got drafted in 59.
That's interesting.
And so he kind of combined everything. Black, white, rockabilly, slick, because he could do it all. People kind of take Elvis for granted.
Yeah.
But Elvis could sing any kind of ballad. Elvis could sing gospel.
Absolutely.
Elvis could sing blues. and he was in the Army while I was in high school. But there were still records coming out. And then you had, the saccharine stuff. I'm gonna really make a confession here, Brent. We liked the saccharine stuff.
Yeah.
We went from saccharine to Odetta to Pete Seeger, back to saccharine to Chuck Berry. It was kind of. It's not that we didn't make distinctions, because we definitely made distinctions. And we thought that we knew when we were liking schlock.
Yeah.
I know, and I'm not talking about my generation. I mean, Carl and Mark and Janet and Alice and I knew and Rick, we knew when we were liking schlock, and we knew when we were liking the good stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
We enjoyed them both. The good stuff is what we sang. We didn't sing schlock. And when I say sang, I'm giving you the impression that we could sing. I'm not very sure about that. But Rick could sing, and Alice could sing, and Janet could probably sing. I don't think Mark played string bass, and he sang some. But Carl and I'm not sure what we were doing there, except we were the cool kids. So,
was there divisions, like teenage divisions, like rockers and beatniks, and like, was that a thing in your teenage life, where there was like kind of hard and fast divisions between subcultures?
No.
Yeah.
If anybody were the beatniks at Coburn Classical Institute, it was me and Carl.
Yeah.
And Rick. We were the beatniks because we read that poetry. We had the New American Poetry, that anthology, and we read that poetry, and we talked about that poetry, and we wrote that poetry, imitating it. So we were doing that, and we were dancing at the school dances, mostly the schlock, and we were doing this folk song group. And then Bob Dylan came out with those early albums, and I was still in high school, and
so we're talking, what is that, 61, 62?
61, 62. Okay. I graduated in June of 63.
Okay.
And I wasn't very impressed by Bob Dylan. Okay? I thought Blowin' in the Wind was the stupidest song I ever heard, and I still think so. But, and when Freewheelin' came out on Columbia, and I forget exactly where I was, but somebody came to me with a new Dylan album, Freewheelin'. And I recognized some of his other songs on the earlier albums were really good. It wasn't like I was just knee-jerk. But overall, I just didn't like him. And I said, how freewheeling can he be? He's recording for Columbia. Come on. If he was really freewheeling, he'd been recording for Verve or some,
yeah,
funkier label. And a friend of mine, David Duke Rosenthal, who died last June, he got his guitar, and he took me to a secluded place, and he played and sang Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. And I went, holy shit, I take it all back. My God, this guy's a genius. Because there'd never been a song like that. Hard Rain changed what song meant. Period. No qualifiers on that. In the Western world, Hard Rain changed what song meant. Song meant something different after Hard Rain. Hard Rain opened all the doors that everybody else walked through soon after. For good and for ill, but all the doors.
Mm-hmm.
And so that stuff had started happening, I mean, hard not to get when Freewheeling came out, like some late in 62, early 63, something like that. Nat Hentoff had wrote the liner notes for Freewheeling and said that Dylan had written the Hard Rain during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was actually a lie. I don't know if Nat Hentoff knew that, but he'd written it earlier than that. But he was a visionary, whether he wanted to be or not, Bob Dylan. And when he said he saw guns and swords in the hands of young children, that hadn't happened yet, but it would. And it was a hard rain. That hadn't happened yet, but it would. Napalm would rain. Cluster bombs would rain. Drones would rain. But right at first, as a kind of out-of-tune folk singer up in Waterville, Maine, I basically had the smug, most popular kid in high school reaction of oh, that's not so much. And I shudder to say it, but I was the most popular kid in high school. It was a very small high school, yeah. And I was getting a touch of that sort of fame, and yet I didn't get the good marks. My teachers liked me because I was respectful, but I didn't get the good marks, and nobody counted much of a future for me. I was a ward of somebody. As far as they knew, I didn't have a family. I didn't have money. I got into a two-bit school in Vermont. And then my life changed again. Maybe this is part two. The basic thing that happened to me the years 1959 to 1963 in terms of writing is that I had three teachers, Mr. Carlo, Mr. Judson, and Mrs. Willard, who gave me tools that I don't see people graduating from college and with MAs and all that having. It was the last of an old-time tradition of New England schooling that put you through your hoops, that demanded results, that taught you basic stuff. Now, saying that, did we study one black writer? No. Did we study one woman writer? No. Did we study slavery? No, but of course, you're New England. There's a statue in the park near the school was of a Civil War Union soldier. It was assumed what side you were on. But nevertheless, that assumption was pretty thin. So, I'm not saying it was a perfect education, but what they did give us wasn't what they gave me was incredibly important. And I based the whole rest of my life in terms of my skills on that. Because as we find out pretty soon in my story, I didn't stay in college very long and I never graduated from anything.
Okay, well, you've made it another neat hour out of part 2, just by chance. So, are you good stopping there for that part?
I'm good stopping there.
Okay, all right, good. Okay.